G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Today we are doing a deep dive on positions in a positional analysis video. And what do they mean? What positions score the best in each category? Does it matter when we're drafting? And who has some funky and useful positions for us to draft in our fantasy basketball drafts? Let's go!
Jordan open. Chicago with the lead. Bryant to Shaq.
Not a game. We talking about practice.
LeBron James with no regard for human life. Anything's possible.
Back out to Allen. His three-pointer. Bang! Curry for three. Wow! Unbelievable. Making it rain in New York. We the North are now we the champions.
Not the destination, it's the journey. Mamba out.
G'day and welcome again to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I am your host, Mitch Casey. That is my name. And you can find me on Twitter at Ball Boys Fantasy. And just off the top of the show, guys, like we said, we're going to go through some positional analysis in today's podcast. This is kind of like the sister episode to the previous podcast that we did, which was statistical scarcity. So using these two episodes, we're going to come up with a really good understanding of where certain categories and where statistics can be found in the drafts and what kind of positional type of player they are attached to. And this can give us a really good understanding of where and how quickly we need to form our opinion in certain punt builds, and what categories can be salvaged later and maybe don't need to be punted even if we are slightly behind in some of these other things. So I hope that all makes sense when we start this video. However, before we get started again, just a reminder, if you want to join me and verse me in a 30-team head-to-head category leagues, weekly lineups, $25 entry for the Ball Boys Championship 30 League. The details to enter the league will be held at the end of this podcast, but just before we get started, make sure you are following me on Twitter at Ball Boys Fantasy. That is essential to getting into the league. But at the end of the video and end of the podcast today, guys, we will be going through some step-by-step details on how to enter that league, because there will be obviously 29 spots. I'm in the league, 29 other spots available, so limited availability. But if you want a chance to beat me, well, verse me, lose to me in fantasy basketball this season, you can hang around to the end of the episode and I'll talk you guys through how to do that. So let's go into talking about positions. Now, before I go into the heavy nitty-gritty nerdy kind of stats that I've prepared for today, a lot of the times we talk about positions, and maybe some of you might be coming over from a fantasy football perspective as well, and positions in that kind of a scenario is very, very important, because when you're, drafting like a running back versus a quarterback, there might be so many quarterbacks that score X amount of points, but only a few running backs that score this much. So you've got to prioritize getting those running backs over the quarterbacks. In basketball, not that big of a difference, okay? So in terms of like prioritizing certain positions over other positions because of the lack of, whatever, I don't think it's that important. So let me get that right off the bat. The focus of today is more so on, like we sort of said, the previous episode talking about statistical scarcity. So marrying up that data with the categories that each position produces and the averages between all of those positions. And so we can sort of get a better understanding of, when a center averages, for example, 5 assists per game versus a point guard averaging 5 assists per game, should they be weighted equally, or is there an argument to say that that is more valuable from the center than it is from the guard? And I'll give you my thoughts and opinions on that as we go through. So let's go into it now. Again, a little bit of a nerdy exercise here, but I hope it makes sense as we go along. So let's talk about points again. So talking about points as a category. Now, when we divide it up between the different categories, this is how it works out. Now, again, for this exercise, I've used my -1 rankings. So my top 120, all of the point guard eligible players, according to Yahoo, is where I've gotten this data. So if they are point guard eligible, that's what they've been used. If they're shooting guard eligible, that's what they've been used. So there are some overlaps, obviously, some, the dual position, so point guard, shooting guard. you've used their data in both sample sizes, but this is to get a greater understanding of what each position does, because obviously you can move and mix and match them depending on what other positions you have in your team. So if we go through these ones here for points, point guards average the most in terms of points at 20.4 inside the top 120. The shooting guards average 19.9, small forwards 20.2, power forwards 19.4. So all within 1 point per game between all those positions. So really not too much difference at all, except for when it comes to the center, which averaged 16.6. So 4 points per game difference between centers and point guards, which were the most, or just under 4 points per game. So on average, centers score fewer points than all of the other positions. So again, this is a key thing for us to remember, because when we draft someone such as let's talk about like a Jaren Jackson Jr., for example, or even someone like an Evan Mobley, they're not necessarily scoring a lot of points per game. If we see in the top 120, the average in points per game is 18.9. So even though they might be scoring 18 or 17 points per game, it might be below average overall, but above average for that center position. Now, I think that this is important because depending on how you structure your team, if you're drafting a center, then you can only put that center in a certain amount of positions on your lineup. Yes, I know we have utility and flex positions, but usually we've probably only got maybe maximum of 3 of those in our starting lineups. And you could have 5 centers and 2 center spots and 3 utilities, and that's all well and good. But for example, we might be limited somewhat in terms of how many of a certain position we can have. So if I'm drafting a center, then I am forfeiting the opportunity cost of that position providing me X amount of stats. So if I have a center who's giving me 15 points, I can now, and he's taking up my center position, I can't put obviously someone else in there that's averaging more points. I need to put them on a utility spot, which might otherwise be taken up by another point guard that I might prefer to have in that position. So for me, I think it actually does matter. Now, it's not the be-all and end-all. I think it's definitely maybe slightly lower compared to that statistical scarcity stuff that we talked about in the last podcast. But it does make a difference, in my opinion, especially when we are talking about punt strategies in... I think points is probably a bad example, but in a few of these categories, it does make a bit more sense. Let's go on to the next one. Rebounds. Now, very obviously, the point guards average the fewest, 4.3, and it kind of just goes up towards the top here. So shooting guards 4.6, small forwards 5.5, power forwards 7.2, and centers average 9.5 rebounds across all of the centers in the top 120 of my -1 rankings. Of the top 20, regardless of position, the average was 6.4 rebounds per game. So we spoke about in the previous podcast that rebounds were quite flat, and that is because a lot of the centers can be found in many parts of the draft this season, at least in my opinion, but we still obviously see this category dominated by centers. So that is to say, though, that if you draft a center that rebounds, 7 or 8 rebounds per game, you're a bit behind the ball game, because you're going to probably have to draft more centers, have more of those players at that position, or get some out of position stats to make up with that. Whereas in general, those guards and small forwards, for example, don't rebound quite as much. This next one here is another interesting one. So let's talk about assists. And this is where I think we could illustrate that punt strategy a little bit more clearly, in my opinion. So if we talk about assists per position, so point guards obviously average the most at 6 assists per game for point guards. Shooting guards, the next at 4.6. Small forwards and power forwards, interestingly, the same at 3.7. And centers obviously average the least at 2.7. So this is when we talk about going into punt strategies. And I see a lot of people do this. They'll go with someone and they'll draft someone like a Joel Embiid in the first round. And actually, let's do this as an exercise. If I bring up... Okay, so we're over here on Basketball Monster, and we're looking at the rankings from last year. So just using them to illustrate a point in this example here. So if I go and I'm drafting Joel Embiid, now you can look at his stats here, and you can see that from his production point of view, threes, assists, and steals, turnovers obviously, but so are everyone else who's in the first round. Threes, assists, and steals are sort of his worst categories. He's excellent in rebounds, points, blocks, field goal percentage, free throw percentage. That's all amazing. So you might look at these kind of lower stats here and think, okay, in terms of assists, that's one of his worst categories. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to punt that category because it's one of his worst categories. And I want to build on Joel Embiid's strengths. However, Joel Embiid is averaging 4.2 assists and he is a center-only player. And like we said, when we talk about averages for centers in assists average 2.7. So he is nearly 1.5 assists better than average. So when you go into this second round and you're able to get a guard and maybe look at someone who's got a similar kind of 1.5 assists better than average, which would be about 7.5 assists, you're looking really strong in that category still, even though Joel Embiid isn't typically what you would consider a big assist volume player, because you've locked up some of those assists in your center position and still been able to manage to get your rebounds, your field goal percentage, your blocks, all of those really, really good things that another center would give you. But this center here is also giving you some good assists. And you might be able to, instead of grabbing another one in round 3 or 4, you might be able to get 2 guards or 2 wings in a row and then be really strong in that one quite comfortably. Another example here might be someone like a Steph Curry on the opposite end of things. Now, Steph Curry, again, point guard, 6.3 assists is what he averaged last year. We could do this example again with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Now, he put up 5.5 assists. When we compare them to the average of point guards, point guard averages 6 assists for the top 120. So Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, whilst he's a positive contributor in total, but compared to other point guards, other players that play his position, he's actually below. He's actually a negative when you compare to another guard that you could have instead of Shai in that position. You go through these other guards, if you want to get a James Harden, a Fred VanVleet, all these guys later that you could get bigger boosts to your assists than him. So you might actually think that even though Shai gives you more assists than a Joel Embiid, Shai is probably the better player to punt the assist category because of his average versus his position, in my opinion. Because then in the second round, when you go to get a big, so in these two scenarios, if I grab a big in the first round and a guard in the second round, if I did it the other way and went Shai, and then in the second round I grab another big, one of the next best bigs might be like a Jaren Jackson Jr., for example, or I don't know, someone like a Miles Turner, or one of these guys, Kristaps Porzingis. I know these might be different this year, but in that scenario, I'm averaging way fewer assists, even though I started with a player with a better assist contribution. So for that reason, and I think that's important to highlight when we talk about these positional averages in terms of beginning and setting our sights on a punt build, so that we don't just lock in and go, this is his worst category, when it might be bad overall, might be subpar overall, but for other players that play his position, it actually might be a really big boost. So to me, that is a key highlight here, and something that I think this exercise can help us with. And just sort of understanding what's like a pass mark, what's like a good target for each position. Like, if I can get someone who averages 6 assists in a point guard position, okay, that's all right. That's a pass, that's average. But if I can get 6 assists from my power forward, that's amazing. That's really good. That's almost, over 2 assists better than average. So I think that is important to sort of grasp and get your head around. Let's talk about threes. Now, obviously, there's a lot of threes in the NBA progressively over the last couple of years, but there's still a big discrepancy between our guards, 2.3, 2.4 for our shooting guards, 2.2 with our small forwards. Power forwards starts to drop a little bit at 1.6, and our centers again 0.6. So you've got a lot of centers in the fantasy drafts that don't shoot any threes, so that can be something that brings you down. So if you're getting a center that's hitting 1 3 per game, that's a positive for that that position versus a point guard shooting 1-3 per game, you would be not too happy about that, because I could fill that position with something else. Now, again, you could go out, and there are some centers that shoot a couple threes per game, and you can get that, but there's not that many, and it means that those players, if you are using that argument, become more important to you, and there's less room for error when you rely on grabbing those guys and to get those out of position stats. So just something, again, just to keep in mind. Steals, a little bit more even across the board. So point guards 1.15, shooting guards 1.11, small forwards 1.05, power forwards 0.94, and then again another decent drop away to the centers at 0.77. So of the top 100, the average is 1 steal per game. So I think that's, for most positions, pretty good to aim for. That 1 steal is what we would consider a pass mark. And the centers, maybe you drop that down to sort of like that 0.8 kind of a mark. So it's a little bit less likely you're going to get your steals from your centers compared to other positions, but otherwise pretty even across the board. Blocks, obviously pretty similar, but obviously in the reverse to assists. So the point guards don't get many, 0.37, 0.41, 0.52 for small forwards, 0.85 for power forwards, and centers get you 1.32. Now, I've had a little gripe, I guess, with players such as like Domantas Sabonis in the past, because he doesn't give you many block shots, and he's also a poor free throw percentage shooter. So he doesn't fit those perfect punt builds nicely. I prefer my centers to, if I'm going to go after those big man stats, to block me shots, or at least, closer to that 1, to 1.3, that average mark. And I think that average this season is going to be higher than previous seasons because of a few other shot blockers that are joining the league. But because I need to get my blocks basically from my power forwards and my centers, I'm not going to rely on guys in my point guard position to carry me in blocks. It's just not really feasible. Now, you can get guys who don't pull you back and don't hurt you in blocks. They're obviously players that do better in other categories than not, but for the vast majority of things, on average, you could draft 4 point guards that are equal to 1 center in terms of the block category. So when you are looking to be competitive in that, if you are drafting centers that don't block shots, you are, I guess, missing out on opportunities to build on the strength in that category. Despite the average across the league being 0.73 blocks per game. And again, just to reiterate this, I think blocks, you're going to need more blocks than normal to be competitive this season, in my opinion, based on my projections. Let's talk field goal percentage. This one surprised me. Field goal percentage, point guards, 44.9%. I've mucked up the percentages there. Not 0.449%, 44.9%, so ignore that on the screen there. Shooting guards, 46.7%, small forwards, 47.5%, power forwards, 49.4%, and then centers make a massive leap up to 57.9%. But the interesting thing, and the thing that surprised me the most, was of the top 120, the average in field goal percentage was 50.4%. Now, I think, firstly, this makes me want to go back and check all my projections, but 2 reasons why I think this could be legit. Number one, I think that the center position is the deepest that it's been in years. So there are many more centers, I think, that are going to be going inside the top 120 this season than there have been in seasons past. Number 2, I think a lot of the time, well, in the NBA, a lot of players are learning to become more and more efficient, to become better and better players. So teams are taking less, those mid-range shots. They're shooting high-volume threes, or they're getting to the rim. So I think over the past 10 or so years, players in terms of field goal percentage are just getting better, even though the volume of threes are getting higher. And combine that with the higher prevalence of centers in this season in particular, that 50.4% is probably unusually high. Now, again, with the percentages, both the free throw and field goal percentage, this is not necessarily the most indicative of the value, but it's probably a good understanding in terms of like a pass-fail. You do also need to take into account how much volume your player is shooting. So those centers, typically, if we go back to the points per game, they're going to be lower volume. So it is weighted it's not realistic to expect your team to average 50.4% and be average. If your team averaged that for your team, that would be very, very strong because a lot of those point guards, shooting guards, small forwards will be taking more shots than the centers at 58%. So when you apply a bit more of a weighting to it, it won't be quite this high. So keep that in mind, but just from a pure average of all of the percentages in every position, that's what it comes out to, 50.4, but that is heavily influenced by that 58% from the centers there. So keep that one in mind. And then free throw percentage, again, pretty even across the board until we get to the bigger guys. So point guards, 82.8%, so 83. Shooting guards, 83.3. Small forwards, 82.0. Power forwards, 79.3. And then centers again at 72.5. So again, a good illustration that we need to give these guys different pass marks. So if you've got a center that averages 75% from the line, on the top 120, 79% is the average, so you'd be considered below average. But compared to other players in that position, it's actually not too bad. It's actually better than a lot of other alternatives that you would be drafting in that position. So, again, we've got to try and give it a little bit of a different, rate it a little bit differently to potentially like a point guard who averages 80%. That's actually not that great compared to its positional average. So you might be missing out on a chance to bolster your free throw percentage by drafting someone who's only at 80% because you know that when you're drafting your centers later, they're going to drag it back down again. Again, there are some exceptions, of course, like every other rule and category, but in general and through the averages, which is what this data is representing, that is how it sort of picks up here. So that's how it all looks up in terms of categories per position. I thought that was an interesting exercise to go through. Let me know what your thoughts are down below in the comment section below. To finish up the podcast today, what we're also going to just finish up with is some interesting players, specific players that have unusual, weird, or useful positioning in at Yahoo. So I've used Yahoo. I could have gone through all of them, but that just would take too much time, and I don't want to bore you guys too much with this one. But on Yahoo, I always find this very interesting because depending on your punt builds, you might be looking for a specific type of player to fill your point guard and center position, usually the two that we want to be paying most attention to. Sometimes power forwards as well. But if we look at point guards, I want to highlight 4 players here that are useful or unusual, one of the two. So Donovan Mitchell, not that unusual, but useful for the fact that he is a player that despite averaging only 4.4 assists, he is one of the sort of top 20 players and one of the best point guards in the NBA in terms of fantasy basketball because he averages huge points, huge threes, 1.5 steals, pretty decent field goal percentage, and that 48.4%. So again, we look back here, 48.4%. That is well above the average of 44.9 for point guards. So for his position, that's really quite good. And even though it's a slight negative for his position, really strong. He also averages 86.7% from the free throw line on really good attempts. So he's someone that if you in a punt assist build, for example, is probably one of the best point guards to have in your team because his value doesn't come just from those big assists like a lot of other point guards do. The next 3 here, guys, are probably guys that I didn't expect to have the point guard positional eligibility, but we've got Jalen Green, who's point guard, shooting guard eligible. Gary Trent Jr., who's point guard, shooting guard eligible. The great point guard, Gary Trent Jr., and his 1.6 assists per game. Yeah, what a point guard. Bruce Brown is also another interesting one. We'll talk about him again in a second. He's got 3 positions in point guard, shooting guard, and small forward. So, again, these guys, not big assists, but in the case of Jalen Green, you've got some really big points. Gary Trent Jr., you've got great points, steals, and threes, good free throw percentage, low turnovers if you care about that. And then Bruce Brown, he's kind of just like a jack of all trades. He gives you some really nice steal numbers, decent enough block numbers, again, from the point guard eligible player. If you're looking for those kind of stats from a guy that you can put at that position, then that is something at least useful, especially later in drafts when you can pick them up quite late. That is definitely something that I think is worthwhile looking at as well. All right, the next one here, weird, wacky, useful positions. We've got players with lots of positions, 3 or more. Josh Giddey, funnily enough, Doesn't have point guard eligibility, which I find crazy, but he is a shooting guard, small forward, power forward. So again, if you were in a bit of a punt big man stats, you could put Josh Giddey as your power forward. So if you're getting 7+ assists from your power forward player in your fantasy team, that is really nice. Paul George, Brandon Ingram, Franz Wagner are all also shooting guards, small forwards, and power forwards. So again, those punt big man stats, really useful to have Paul George as your power forward or Brandon Ingram as your power forward. Franz Wagner, all of them give you great free throw percentage, points, threes, assists, steals from Paul George especially. Really handy for that position there. And then, of course, on the other side of things, Bruce Brown and Ben Simmons. Bruce Brown, like I said, point guard, shooting guard, small forward, and he's going to give you decent field goal percentage, steals, blocks from that position. And then Ben Simmons is one of the weirder ones I've seen. He's a point guard, he's a shooting guard Ben Simmons, the lethal shooting guard, and he's a power forward eligible player. So that's just skip small forward. I think he also played a bit of center last year as well, so I don't know, why don't we just give them all 5? Like, why not? But Ben Simmons, obviously, if you're looking for those rebounds, field goal percentage, blocks from a point guard eligible player, steals, he's not going to get you 3, he's not going to give you a good free throw percentage like most other point guards would, but he can give you those sort of out of position, better than positional average stats. So he's a good one for those punt threes or punt free throw percentage builds as well. And then on the other side of things, at the centers, useful centers that you might not realize are centers. Giannis is actually a center this season over on Yahoo, which I don't know how useful it is, but it's interesting at least. Pascal Siakam is a go-to one for me. He's a really nice guy because, again, averaging big points for that position. We saw before points in centers is down, assists in centers are down. His free throw percentage isn't the best, but again, 77.4%. It is on decent volume, but if you compare that to someone else you could have in that position, say you had someone like a Mitchell Robinson in that position shooting 48%, it's a lot less of a hit in that category than, Pascal Siakam's 77. Despite it being below par, it's still, for his position, not too bad. Zion Williamson is center eligible, and I think that's a really fascinating one because he's a huge boost to your field goal percentage. He doesn't necessarily give you center-type rebounds and blocks. He gives you great points, way more points than other centers would. He gives you decent assists for a center-eligible player as well. The steals would be about average. So, yeah, just a really interesting one. Doesn't necessarily fit a build super neatly, but maybe if you wanted to go with like a real funky punt, rebounds, or punt blocks, but still want to maybe look after your field goal percentage, if there maybe are a few other teams that are also punting field goal percentage, and you just want to throw in Zion, if you're really strong under free throws, maybe you started with a Damian Lillard and then a Trae Young, and you're looking to punt that block category, but maybe someone like a Zion could get that field goal percentage up to respectable, and you can beat a lot of those other teams that are punting field goal percentage. Something interesting because, again, the points are amazing. The assists are pretty good. Again, if you can slot him here at center, I think it's definitely something worthwhile considering. And then the last one there, Jabari Smith Jr. is another really interesting one. So, again, a guy who can give you threes, he can give you decent enough points and free throw percentage. Fingers crossed the steals come back like he put up in college, although I'm not absolutely banking on it, but he is someone that, again, if you wanted just a center that can give you some good threes and points, he can do so without hurting you too much from the free throw line there as well. If you're punting field goal percentage, you're not too worried about his lack of boost in that category. So just ones that, if you weren't aware, can be used as centers on Yahoo. They might be different on other sites there as well, but just for those people who are on Yahoo, really useful, especially for those really aggressive punts where we're punting 3 or 4 categories. Those guys are usually quite pivotal. All right. So thank you very much for listening today, guys. To finish it up, just to give you, if you are keen on joining the 30-team Ball Boys Championship 30 League, to do so, you need to be following me on Twitter at Ball Boys Fantasy. You need to then go over to Apple Podcast. I think I said Spotify on the last podcast. You can't actually write a review on Spotify. You can only give the 5-star rating. So give us the 5-star rating, but to enter the competition, you need to go onto Apple Podcast, give us a 5-star rating and review. And in your review, where you write down your kind, lovely words, put in your Twitter handle. And then when I see the most creative, the funniest, the funnest, and the most standout reviews, I'm going to message you on Twitter and grab some details so I can get you in the league. So you have to leave your handle in that description so I know how to find you on Twitter. And you have to be following me on Twitter so I can then communicate with you. So those things have to happen. Make sure you guys are giving me the funnest and most creative reviews. Those ones will stand out to me. We'll be inviting 29 people to come and join me to do that one. Weekly changes, $25. Get your reviews in there, guys. And until next time, I'll see you later. Bye.